You know, there's a procedure that happens every single day in operating rooms in ICUs all over the world. One we totally take for granted. But its origins? They weren't cooked up in some shiny, sterile lab. Nope. This story starts in the mud and the absolute chaos of World War I, born from a crisis that was killing soldiers long after they'd actually left the battlefield. So, let's get into how one of the cornerstones of modern medicine was forged in the face of a challenge that seemed completely impossible.
This quote, wow, it just gets right to the heart of it, doesn't it? The broken gargoyles, that's the gut-wrenching name given to soldiers with the most horrific facial injuries you can imagine. They were brought to a special hospital at Sidcup, England for groundbreaking reconstructive surgery. But the very tool that was supposed to make that surgery possible, anesthesia, was, more often than not, a death sentence.
So why? Why was this happening? Well, to really get the genius of the innovation they came up with, you first have to understand just how terrifying surgery was in the early 20th century. Okay, so this was the standard method. It was called the open drop technique. And it was exactly as crude as it sounds. An anesthetist would literally just drip a powerful chemical, like chloroform or ether, onto a gauze mask and hold it over the patient's face. They were trying to walk this impossibly fine line between unconsciousness and, well, accidentally killing the patient.
Now, for a soldier with a shattered jaw or severe facial trauma, this technique was an absolute catastrophe waiting to happen. The second they went under from the anesthetic, all that damaged tissue, their swollen tongue, it would just collapse backward and completely block their airway. They would suffocate right there on the operating table.
And this slide just perfectly captures the central conflict. Think about it. The surgeon needs a clear, unobstructed view to work on the patient's face, but the anesthetist needs to press a mask firmly onto that same face to deliver the gas. Their goals were mutually exclusive. It was this impossible tug-of-war that led to disaster. Either the patient wasn't getting enough anesthesia and would wake up, or the anesthetist would use too much and cause a fatal overdose. Something had to give.
And that change came, as it so often does in medicine, from a tragedy. It took one single, high-profile death to force the entire medical community to stop and rethink everything they thought they knew.
And this is a story that's powerfully told in Lindsay Fitzharris's book, The Facemaker. Private William Henry Young, this man was a decorated war hero. He'd earned the Victoria Cross, the highest award for bravery. He went through the absolute hell of the trenches and survived, only to die on an operating table, not from his wounds, but from the anesthesia.
One. Just one. The death of this one man made the problem impossible to ignore. He wasn't killed by an enemy bullet. He wasn't killed by a slip of the surgeon's knife. He was killed by a fundamental flaw in the system, something they started calling the anesthesia gap.
The head surgeon, a true pioneer named Sir Harold Gillies, he had this devastating realization. All of his amazing, revolutionary techniques for facial reconstruction were completely useless if his patients couldn't survive the anesthesia to begin with. He made a declaration. Solving this anesthesia problem was now priority number one, and that led him to bring in two doctors who were about to change the world, Ivan Magil and Stanley Robotham.
So Magil and Robotham, they looked at this tug-of-war we talked about between the surgeon and the anesthetist, and they basically said, we're not playing this game anymore. They came up with an idea that was just completely radical for the time.
And here's the core of their genius. They decided to just bypass the battlefield altogether. Instead of fighting for control over the patient's mouth and nose, they thought, what if we deliver the anesthetic from the inside? They figured out how to pass a flexible rubber tube past the mouth, past the throat, and directly into the windpipe, the trachea. This, right here, is the birth of modern endotracheal intubation.
Now this is where it gets really clever. They didn't just have the idea, they solved all the practical problems that came with it. First, they started using wider, more flexible rubber tubes, which made it way easier for the patient to breathe on their own. Second, and this is incredible, since they were essentially working blind, Magil invented a special pair of angled forceps to guide the tube into place just by feel. And third, they created a two-tube system, one for anesthetic going in and one for carbon dioxide coming out, so patients weren't just rebreathing their own toxic air. Every single one of these was a huge leap forward.
And here's the part that just blows my mind. Those exact forceps, designed over a century ago in what was basically a makeshift war hospital, they are still a critical, life-saving tool today. You can walk into any modern hospital, find the difficult airway cart, and I promise you, you will find a pair of Magil forceps. Their solution wasn't just good for its time, It was nearly perfect.
And this legacy, it reaches so far beyond the operating room. What happened at Sidcup is actually woven into the DNA of modern nursing and critical care.
Just look at this timeline. It shows a complete shift in medical thinking. Before Sidcup, a great surgeon was often the fastest surgeon. But Magill and Robotham proved that speed means nothing if the patient's airway isn't secure. They made the airway the absolute first priority. And that principle evolved directly into what we now call the ABCs: airway, breathing, circulation. It's the unbreakable foundational rule of all emergency medicine today.
So for any of you out there who are nurses, this is your world. Securing the airway, it's always the first thing you do. Using a cuff tube to protect the lungs from aspiration, that's standard practice now. And meticulously charting a patient's vital signs, that whole practice was born directly from the tragic failures with patients like Private Young. It led to the very first anesthesia records, the ancestors of the charts used to monitor every patient today. So here's the big takeaway. The life-saving work that a nurse does today in an ER or an ICU is a direct continuation of the lessons learned in that terrible, brutal hothouse of innovation at Sidcup. Every single time an airway is secured and a life is saved, it's a tribute to the legacy of those broken gargoyles and the doctors who refused to let them die.
And this whole incredible story, it really leaves us with a pretty fascinating question about how progress in medicine actually happens.
Just think about it for a second. The next time you hear about some standard medical procedure, maybe ask yourself, what crisis forced this to exist? What moment of absolute desperation sparked its invention? It's just a powerful reminder that so many of the life-saving standards we have today were paid for by the tragedies of yesterday.
And that wraps up our explainer. All the information we've talked about was drawn from the source material you see here, which really details these profound medical innovations that came out of Sidcup during World War I. Thanks for joining me.